Good day, everyone. We are Group 2, and let us start discussing data privacy. Next slide, please. Thank you. Let's begin with data privacy versus data protection. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, first, data privacy. It simply means that any organizations who deal with your personal details, whereabouts, and preferences are obliged to observe and respect your data privacy rights. The data subject also has the right to learn whether an organization has any personal information about him or her in its computer database and or manual filing system. And if so, to gain reasonable access to it, the data subject may also request that the organization provide him or her with a written description of the type of information it has on file for the data subject, as well as the purposes for which it is retaining it. Sharing the personal data of a person should have an obvious reason or purpose that the owner knows before anyone else. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, for this one, is your contact number, your exact location, or any personal details about you that somebody might be able to use somewhere is in your social media account? Maybe this is the right time for you to realize that this is something that is not safe. Personal information should be obtained lawfully for a specific purpose and should not be used for unauthorized surveillance or profiling by governments or third parties, nor should it be used for unrelated purposes without consent. And it is your responsibility to know where you are sharing your personal details or information. You have to be mindful of who you are sharing your details with. Next slide, please. Maybe right now you are asking yourself, how about my personal information that I input on a website? For example, when you are buying online, it is important that your personal details like address, name, and contact number are included to make sure that your parcel will be delivered with you. Don't worry because this is where the individual's right to control how their personal information is collected and used. It is referred to as information privacy. Many people believe that data privacy is the most important consumer protection issue today. One factor that contributes to this is increasing technological sophistication as well as the types of data collected as a result. That's all for data privacy. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Let us now move on to data protection. It is sometimes also called data security. A data protection strategy is vital for any organization that collects, handles, or stores sensitive data. Next is data protection is the process of safeguarding important information from corruption, compromise, or loss. A large part of data protection strategy is ensuring that data can be restored quickly after any corruption or loss. Protecting data from compromise and ensuring data privacy are other key components of data protection. Any organization that wants to work effectively needs to ensure the safety of their information by implementing a data protection plan. Next slide, please. Thank you. Some believe that trust once lost can never be regained. It is important that your personal information should be kept between you and the person you trusted with. Next is loss of self-determination. If that same person was now in self-determination, they might instead look for other things that they can blame. That is why the right to information of self-determination protects the freedom and development of the personality and is therefore also called the right of personality. It allows everyone to decide for themselves which personal data may be disclosed or used. According to Weston's description of privacy, the right of the individual to decide what information about himself should be communicated to others and under what circumstances. Next is loss of autonomy. Privacy of personal information is a condition of autonomy because it enables individuals to control what information about them can and cannot be accessed and collected because information privacy is linked to autonomy. Next is loss of liberty. Liberty is the freedom to go wherever you want, which you lose when you are a prisoner. Modern technology allows us to trade privacy for security. Some argue that this allows us to preserve liberty while gaining security. Next is exclusion. Exclusions are the cases for which the insurance company does not provide coverage. These are the conditions excluded from the insured event to avoid losses to the company. Next is physical harm. The more sensitive the information, the higher the risk of harm to the people affected. A combination of personal information is usually more sensitive than a single piece of personal information. Next is health information. Health information like driver license, and credit card details can all cause harm on their own, but together they could be used for identity theft. Next is discrimination. Discrimination can be damaging even if you haven't been the target of overt act of bias. Unfair discrimination comes in various forms, and it affects people in different ways, and not all countries have anti-discrimination laws. Next is stigmatization. Stigma refers to a distinguishing personal trait that is perceived as or actually is physically, socially, or psychologically disadvantageous. Disadvantage. Somebody may see someone and use their personal information in a negative way. Next is power imbalance. Certain challenges arises when consent is given in a scenario where power is unequally distributed, such as circumstances that include, for example, is when data is handled in the context of an employment relationship or when public agencies provide services. And that's all for processing personal information can create problems for individuals. Next slide, please. Thank you. Let us now move on to the RA number 10173 or the Data Privacy Act of 2012. Public Act number 10173, otherwise known as the Data Privacy Act, is a law that seeks to protect all forms of information, be it private, personal, or sensitive. It is meant to cover both natural and persons involved in the processing of personal information. We are identified as individuals based on information that is relevant to us, such as names, date of birth, residences, photos, identity cards, or educational, work, and health information. And the list goes on and on. The government keeps records of our births for both registrations and other personal information in databases or file systems. When we use services or products and go online or fill out a form, records containing information about us are most likely being maintained in a private company. Different parts of our data are collected, kept, and used for diverse purposes in the digital era. There should be no doubt about the importance of information. Consider a future in which the collecting of personal data is outlawed. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. As stated in the Data Privacy Act of 2012, it is the state's policy to protect the fundamental human right of privacy of communication while ensuring free flow of information to promote innovation and growth. The Data Privacy Act attempts to safeguard all types of information, whether private or personal or sensitive. It is intended to apply to both natural and legal people who are involved in the processing of personal data. Next slide, please. Thank you. The Data Privacy Act of 2012 mandates the National Privacy Commission, or NPC, to monitor the country's compliance with international standards for data protection. According to their website, the National Privacy Commission is the country's privacy watchdog and an independent body mandated to administer and implement the Data Privacy Act of 2012 and to monitor and ensure compliance the country with international standards set for data protection. The National Privacy Commission, as the Philippines data privacy body, is dedicated to protecting data subjects, personal information, and fostering a private culture in order to have the country become more competitive, knowledge-based, and innovative. Next is, unless otherwise required by law, your personal data should never be collected, processed, or kept by any organization without your prior agreement. You have the right to be informed. Lastly, in general, data privacy refers to a person's ability to choose when, how, and to what extent personal data about them is shared with or conveyed to others. This personal information can include a person's, like I said, name, address, phone number, and online and open contact. And that is all for the brief summary of the Data Privacy Act of 2012. May I call on Ms. Lajon to continue the discussion? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Indinga. Now let us proceed to the scope of Data Privacy Act of 2012. This act applies to the processing of all personal information, meaning to say it deals with the process or operation to preserve or protect all kinds of private data or information to any natural or juridical person involved. It means everyone or all individuals has a right of protection of their private information, such as location information, health or genetic information, and trade union. Now we will discuss it later. Now it also says there that data privacy, although not found or established in the Philippines, use equipment that are located in the Philippines or those who maintain an office and in any branch or agency in the Philippines. So everyone, and even the businesses or the people around the agency deals with Data Privacy Act. Anyone could be the victim of data privacy invasion, or it also could be the culprit or suspect of breaking the law of invasion of data privacy. Now, this act does not apply the following. First is, in short, this is for government or government-affiliated employees or the public officers. They are usually the ones to whom we offer our personal information. It is, of course, for important purposes, and we will not be able to process or obtain something from them unless we provide specific information. Next, these are all the organizations. They require to appoint a data protection officer or the DPO. The data protection officer is responsible for ensuring that all applicable data protection laws and regulations are followed. Now, next is information relating to any discretionary benefit or financial nature, such as the granting of a license or permit given by the government to an individual, including the name of the individual and the exact nature of the benefit. Here, those agencies who give us our benefit information, like the information in our different IDs, of course, they will see our information. It is inevitable, diba? Because they will encode it somewhere so that in case we forgot or we lost, if they can able to retrieve it. Next. Personal information process for journalistic, artistic literacy, or research purposes. Here, we usually put personal information to a certain literary works or arts. Of course, it is for credentials. Next, information necessary in order to carry out the function of public authority, which includes the processing of personal data for the performance by the independent central monitoring authority and law enforcement and regulatory about authority who process personal data for the performance by the independent central monitoring. When we say central monitoring, it is the Bangko Central of the Philippines, while law enforcement and regulatory agency are the Bureau of Corrections, Bureau of Immigrations, National Bureau of Investigations, what else? Public attorney offices, offices of the government council, and etc. DPA does not apply to them because they are the one to process the data, or they are data is a mandated function to them. Next, DPA does not apply to financial institutions because the next is personal information and sensitive information. Personal information is referred to any information from which the identity of an individual is apparent or can be reasonably indirect, ascertained, or when put together with other information would directly uncertain the identity and an individual. It is any information from which an individual's identity is apparent or can be fairly and immediately ascertained, or which, when we combine with other information, would directly and absolutely identify an individual. To put it another way, personal information is any information that may be linked to your identity and used to identify you. According to what I have searched, the examples are individual's name, signature, address, phone numbers or date of birth, employee record information, photographs, internet protocol addresses, or we also call it IP addresses, voice print and facial recognition or biometrics, also location information from a mobile device. And it says in Privacy Act 1988 that it doesn't cover the personal information of someone who has died. Now, let us proceed to the sensitive information. Sensitive data has a higher level of privacy protection than personal data or anything. It can be linked to an individual, and if released could result in harm to the person. If such information is stolen, it can result in personal information getting into the wrong hand as well as identity theft. It comprises facts or opinions about personal lives. It refers to genetic or biometric data in this section: mental or sexual being, sexual preferences, social security numbers, passport numbers, biometric information, medical data, and personal identifiable financial information membership in a labor union, as stated in this slide. About the person, it is also about the person's race, ethnic origin, marital status, age, color, and religious, philosophical, or political affiliations. About an individual's health, education, the genetic or sexual life of a person, or to any proceeding or any offenses committed or alleged to have committed. Now, let's proceed to the next slide. Social Security Number, or SSS, or Tax Identification Number, or TIN, which are issued by government agency unique to an individual, marked as classified by executive order or act of the legislative body of the country. This is referred to as classified data. This refers to any information that is restricted by a government entity due to security concerns. Labeling often has different levels of sensitivity, such as restricted, secret, top secret, and confidential information. Okay, now may I call on for the next discussant? Thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes po.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you for your response. Now, next slide, please. Okay, thank you for that, Ms. Lajon. Now, let's move on with personal information controller. So what do we mean by this? So when we say personal information controller, this refers to an individual. It may be an organization or a group that controls the processing of personal data. From the word itself, personal controller, personal information controller. So it is the authority that controls the processing of personal data. Also, there is control if the individual organization group that this what information is collected or the purpose and extent of the processing. Also, an individual who processes personal data in connection with his or her personal, family, or household affair is not considered a personal information controller. So the term personal information controller also excludes those who process only as instructed by another. For example, in school, di ba, we have personal information about the students that shall be protected, and not only the students information but as well as the school staff's information. So there is a personal information controller within schools that controls the dissemination of personal information that will only be given by authorized people. So sometimes it occurs within the family. Sometimes there is a designated person who was assigned to be this type of individual that will take care of the personal information of each member in the family. However, this couldn't be considered as a personal information controller according to its definition. So next slide. Okay, but before we move on, why is it important why is personal information controller important? So this is because the data controller will be the one to dictate how and why the data is going to be used by the organization. And a data controller can process collected data using its own process. In some instances, however, a data controller needs to work with a third party or an external service, meaning to say it has to extend their work to an external service in order to work with the data that has been gathered. Even in this situation, the data controller will not relinquish control of the data to the third-party service. The data controller will remain in control by specifying how the data is going to be used and processed by that external service. So now let's move on with the next one, which is the personal information processor. Okay, so when it says here, so a personal information processor refers to an individual. It may also be an organization or group that process personal data only upon the instructions of another. So they are usually given access to the personal data of personal information controller under a contract or a service provider agreement. So a personal information processor should not make use of personal data for its own purpose, but must do so only in accordance with the instructions of a personal information controller. So it also has obligations. So these are the obligations of the PIC or the personal information controller. First one is that the PIC should collect personal information for specified and legitimate purposes determined and declared before or as soon as reasonably practicable after collection. So one of the roles of the PIC is to authenticate the purpose of why is the information being gathered. That is not only enclosed at the beginning, yet also affiliated during and after the collection of personal information. Next one, next slide. Okay, the second role of the PIC should collect and process personal information adequately and not excessively, meaning they also must suffice personal information that is exact and accurate, or in simple words, precise, meaning excess and unverified information should not be processed. Next is the PIC should process personal information fairly and lawfully and in accordance with the rights of a data subject. So as the personal controller was given the duty of handling an organization or an individual's information, it must practice and should always be inclined on the given laws and regulations to perform its responsibilities ethically. Next. Okay, thank you. So another role of the PIC is that it should process accurate, relevant, and up-to-date personal information. So aside from the personal information's accuracy, it should also be updated. Emergency purposes, or for example, updating your cell phone under to receive text messages concerning important things. So the fifth one would be the PIC should retain personal information only for as long as necessary for the fulfillment of the purposes for which the data was obtained. The information should be kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary. Meaning, this means that the PIC should not take longer than necessary in obtaining personal data if the purpose was already fulfilled. Once the session is done, this information should be encrypted to avoid issues that might subject the personal information to any unauthorized circumstances. Next slide. The last role of the PIC is that PIC must implement reasonable and appropriate organizational, physical, and technical measures intended for the protection of personal information. So the PIC conforms to the legal rights, and so it also has the right to implement rules and regulation as to whether, where, when, and how the data will be used. This includes the technical measures to protect the individual or organization. So those are the 6 roles of the PIC, or the obligations of the personal information controller. So what would be the difference of the two? Basically, the difference between the two is that a data controller determines the purposes and means of the processing of personal data, while a processor engages in personal data processing on behalf of the controller. So they have relationship, but they are completely different with each other. Next slide. Now let's move on with what is a National Privacy Commission. It says here that the national they want to be responsible for data processing systems and want to be responsible for policies and planning. So the IRR of the DPA defines the function of the Commission as rulemaking, public advisory and education, compliance and monitoring and complaints, investigations and enforcement. So that is the job of the National Privacy Commission. Next slide. Now, may I call on Ms. Concepcion to present this data privacy principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chodaro. So to proceed with our discussion, let me discuss to you the data privacy principles. So there are 3. First is transparency, wherein the data subject must be aware of the nature, purpose, and extent of the processing of his or her personal data, including the risks and safeguards involve the identity of personal information controller, his or her rights as a data subject, and how this can be exercised. Any information and communication relating to the processing of personal data should be easy to access and understand using clear and plain language. Next is the legitimate purpose. The processing of information shall be compatible with a declared and specified purpose, which must not be contrary to the law, moral, or public policy. Lastly, the proportionality. So the process of information shall be adequate, relevant, suitable, and necessary, and not excessive in relation to a declared and specified purpose. Personal data shall be processed only if the purpose of the processing could not reasonably be fulfilled by other means. Next slide, please. So now let's discuss the rights of data subject. So there are 6. So let's start first with the right to information. So data subject should know that personal information relating to them is being processed and the details of the extent of processing. So this means that having notice of the general description of the personal information being processed, the purpose, the scope, the method of processing, and the recipient of the personal information as well. Next is the right to object. So the data subject can object to the personal information processing and should have the opportunity to withdraw consent, particularly if the basis of processing is the data subject consent. Lastly is the right to access and the data portability. Data subjects can access and request for the content of their personal information process and other information relevant to the source of the data, recipients and reasons for disclosure, and any automated decision making. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, next is right to correct. So the data subject had rights to the correction or any inaccuracy or error in their personal information, and they may also request that those who previously received the information be informed of its inaccuracy. Next is the right to erase. So there are 10 reasons why the data subject can erase their personal information. Next, which is the personal data is incomplete, it is outdated, it is false, and was unlawfully obtained. Next is that it was used for unauthorized purposes. It is not necessary to declared purposes, and the withdrawal of consent. And also, processing is prejudicial to data subject. Processing is unlawful. Processing violates the rights of the data subject. Lastly, the right to file a complaint and to damages. So the data subject have a right to file or complain for a data privacy violation if such violation are established, and the data subject will be entitled to payment of damages, which I will discuss next. Next slide, please. All right, so these are the offenses and penalties. So these are the crimes. First one is the unauthorized processing, which means that processing of personal data without the consent of the data subject or without being unauthorized under DPA or the Data Privacy Act or any existing law. So the imprisonment could be 1 year to 6 years, and the person who violates this will pay 500,000 to 4 million. Next is processing of personal sensitive information for unauthorized purposes, which means that processing personal data for other purpose which are no longer authorized by law or consent. So the imprisonment is 1 year and 6 months to 7 years, and the fine is 500,000 to 2 million. Next is the access to personal or sensitive information due to negligence. So the person who provide access to personal data due to negligence without being unauthorized under the Data Privacy Act or any existing law could be imprisoned by 1 to 6 years, and they would pay 500,000 to 4 million. Next slide. The unauthorized access or intentional breach. These are the person who knowingly or unlawfully or violating data confidentiality and securing data system breaks in a way into any system where personal data is stored. So the imprisonment is 1 to 3 years. They would pay 500,000 to 2 million. So concealment of security breach. Person who are after acknowledge of a security breach involving sensitive personal information and the obligation to notify the commission intentionally or by commission conceals the fact. So they would be imprisoned for 1 year to 6 months, and they would pay 500,000 to 1 million. Next slide. So the next offense could be malicious disclosure. So any PIC or PIP or any of its official employees or agents who with malice or bad faith disclose unwanted or false information relative to any personal data obtained by him or her. So they would be imprisoned by 1 year, 6 months, or even 5 years. 500. They would pay 500,000 and 1 million. And lastly, unauthorized disclosure. This is any personal information controller or personal information processor or any of its official employees or agents who disclose to a third party personal information not covered by malicious disclosure. So they would be imprisoned by 1 to 5 years, and they would pay 500,000 to 2 million. Next slide. So next is the improper disposal. So negligently dispose or discard or abandon personal data or area accessible to the public or place in its container for trash collection. They would be imprisoned for 6 months to 3 years, and they would pay 100,000 to 1 million depending on the damage to its data subject. Next is the combination or series of acts. A combination or series or any acts defined as a crime, 3 to 6 years, and they would pay 1 million to 5 million. Next. Next slide. So to continue with the report, let's call Mr. Biso.
Okay, so thank you so much, Ms. Concepcion. Now, for the continuation, let's proceed to the cases of Republic Act 10173 or the Data Privacy Act of 2012. In here, you can see how the application of the imprisonment, crime, and the fine of the action created by the violator. The first is about the first conviction rather, under the Data Privacy Act of 10173 by the Benitez Salen Baldonado law firm. This is the complaint. According to the complaint submitted on June 4, 2015 by the complainant PPO, it was stated that the suspect accessed multiple credit cards accounts of a client credit card company without a call or the actual request from their true owners. In addition, according to the complaint, the suspect additionally fraudulently obtained, or in other words, it is illegally obtained personal identity cards and altered them into temporary pins. A constant sum of $500 was taken as cash advances from all the aforementioned credit cards. To make the long case short, the BPO is the complainant, and they are complaining to a certain person because that person or the suspect uses the BPO client's credit card without their permission. It is also stated in the information that the accused or the suspect, being a customer care professional of a multinational BPO company in the Philippines, he or she illegally accessed and processed the client's credit card without permission or an authority, which was the violation of Section 28 of Republic Act 10173. That's all for the complaint. Now, what about the resolution of this case? According to the discussion earlier by Ms. Concepcion about the offenses and penalties of RA number 10173, this case will be fall under processing of personal information and sensitive personal information for unauthorized purposes. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so the second case is about the 345,000 rather sensitive legal documents from the Philippine government have been exposed online. This is just a recent issue about the breaching of data privacy, and if you're watching e-news, maybe you also know about this. According to the UK cybersecurity firm Turgeonsec. But first, Turgeonsec offers top information security products, uniting the human and technical elements. About 345,000 files from the Philippine Solicitor General, including sensitive material for active legal proceedings, have been reportedly been breached and made publicly available. This is a very sensitive issue because some of the data that have been exposed online contain hundreds of instances of words like rape, execution, and trafficking. On the other hand, the documents were eventually taken down last April 28, but some of the files that have been exposed are still cached on Google search engine and can be found on the open web. Additional information about this issue, the spokesperson expressed concern that the information in the records may be used to identify witnesses or intimidate victims in pending court cases. The Office of the Solicitor General is in charge of representing the government in any action before the Philippine Supreme Court or Court of Appeals. Slide, please. Okay, Thank you. Now we will now proceed to the last part of our discussion, and that is the golden rule of data privacy: is if you can protect it, don't collect it. According to Dr. Len Segan from NPC, or National Privacy Commission, he said that don't collect unnecessary information or data that is not absolutely needed by the organization. In addition, the releasing of personal information or data to any person aside from himself or herself should be with consent. You can see how important the data privacy is, and there are times that when you're filling out a form that includes your personal information, it is always have a consent form that you're agreeing that your information will be used for some events or circumstances. Always remember, when it comes to data privacy, if you are unable to secure your personal data, don't gather it. That would be all for the Data Privacy Act of 2012. Thank you for listening and have a great day ahead.